So Virginia was talking about you, this is your chance. Anything about Virginia?
Well,
just to set the scene here.
yes. Well, I think we both had a very great childhood, and we were very close all the way through as we grew up, actually. I think one of the things we both agree on is that our parents did not micromanage us. They let us grow up and do our own thing, and I think it's been very helpful for both of us during the years.
So, as you were growing up, what was the family? Was it just your mom and dad and the two of you? Or?
That's right.
Yeah. And you grew up in Cheney's Point area.
Yes.
What was it like at that time period? I mean, you were born in 1922, and so we're talking Depression time period. Give us a little sense of that.
Well, the Depression, of course, was almost 10 years later, but I think one of the interesting things was that we grew up really in an extended family. We had grandparents across the highway from us, and the other grandparents were within a quarter of a mile. And we had woods and fields and the lake, many things to keep us very busy. But it's unlike village life. We didn't have other kids our own age around, so we were pretty much left on our own for figuring out things like building Indian villages up in the woods or fishing and many other different things like that.
So you had access to the lake, and what was a normal summer time period like? Did you have access to boats? Did you have access to some of the things we take for granted today? Was that part of your world?
Well, I'm just trying to think. The thing that we had was essentially we were free to roam almost anywhere, and the lake and woods there. The other thing that, of course, later on, Depression period, I was kept busy mowing lawns, delivering papers. I had a 7-mile paper route, wow. Things like that. In fact, that's the only way I got a bicycle was that I signed up to do a paper route. My dad finally figured he better try find a used bike somewhere for me. I started out on my paper route and learned to ride the bike as I went.
So, part of that imagination that being pretty much with you and your sister was, I read someplace where you were into chemistry, or you got early on a chemistry set was really part of your world.
Well, I think we can come back to Chautauqua on that. Thomas Edison was alive, and I heard about his experimenting with making synthetic rubber. So out of milkweed. So I got milkweed and tried to see what I could do. And I can remember somewhere in one of the grade schools they were telling how about the natives in the Amazon dripped this stuff over a pole, over a fire, and smoked it and made crude rubber that way. I didn't have much luck with the milkweed. I don't think Edison did either. He finally got synthetic rubber, but not from milkweed.
So this is a presentation given about you recently at Chautauqua, August of 2014. And it says, what does any young man do, what this was said about you. So what does any young man do when he is bored? He resorts to his home chemistry set. While experimenting one day, he discovered that the little glass tubes would serve perfectly as mini blowguns. Is that right? Did you use this as for a weapon?
Well,
This guy make it up.
we were all a bit bored in school, and actually, school at that point, high school at least, was a big study hall. The girls sat on one side, the boys on the other. And so I brought the little tube with the mustard seed, and you could shoot somebody in the back of the neck, and they couldn't figure out where it was coming from, and so forth. And it caught on. All the rest of them started buying all the mustard seed they could around, and I decided it was time to stop, and the others got the punishment for for it.
Did you feel guilty at that time?
Not at all.
I just want to place a sense of justice you have in your mind. Carolyn also talked about in this presentation that you decided to place several drops of soap in a certain drinking fountain. Talk to me about that. We're learning so much about you here.
Oh, yes. Well, this was chemistry lab, and we were testing hard water with soap solutions and so forth. And the drinking fountains are outside. There was nice big windows so we could see what was happening. And so took a medicine dropper and put a little soap solution in the spout of the drinking fountain. And sure enough, a creature came along, and none of us knew anything about it.
So let me get this straight, Bill. These are just two quick examples. One, other people got thrown under the bus for your activities, and this is another one where you simply shrugged your shoulders and a poor teacher was befuddled, right? Did this set sort of a pattern in the rest of your life here, Bill?
Well, I was feeling rather bored and rebellious at that time, I think.
How's he doing so far, Virginia?
I remember a lot of these things.
You have another incident we should ask him about?
I don't know. I don't want to embarrass him.
I find that hard to believe. So after high school, now what? Where did you go?
Well, actually, I wanted to go into engineering. Again, fascinated with science and so forth. The requirements to get into engineering school, and I wanted to go to RPI, and it required solid geometry and trigonometry, which was not taught in the school. But three of us took a postgraduate year. It was another chance to earn a little more money before going to school, and also to pick up these needed courses. And the principal, George Rayner, was very helpful on this. This was a small school. We had a large graduating class of 40. So.
What school?
Chautauqua, right? The parking lot across from Chautauqua now. He agreed. He said, actually, the law said that there had to be a qualified teacher in the room. So he said, the three of you can teach yourself trigonometry, and if you have questions, well, I'll answer it. Meanwhile, I'll do my work in the room. And so we got along all right. Then he said, well, now here's the key. You mark your own regents exam. One guy had to fail himself. But and then I had a job as a bellhop at the Athenaeum. I was all excited about that. But I needed solid geometry, and the only place that was offered was at Jamestown High School in the summer. Mm-hmm. So I had to give up that job to take solid geometry in Jamestown, and I worked as a painter for my father at the time. And of course, wages during the Depression era, not too high. I think I got 25 cents an hour. A finished carpenter was getting 40 cents an hour. So there's a little contrast between that and today. And then I went on to RPI. The December of my freshman year was Pearl Harbor, and we were told that it would be wise if we joined a reserve corps and then come back to school until we were called up. So I joined the Army Reserve, and the school accelerated their program so that each semester lasted 7 weeks. So by the time I was called up in March, I was halfway through my junior year, starting in September as a sophomore. Mm-hmm. Not absorbing very much. It was, I felt I was not getting an education that way, so I was really relieved to be called up at that point.
And when you were called up, and you went through basic training, what did they assign you to do?
Well, this is very similar path to the video you just saw, the beginning of it, because we had an extended basic training, advanced infantry training in Camp Fannin, Texas. And it seemed rather odd that our whole company were college students. But it was very rough training. And we still didn't know what was happening to us because we didn't know what this was. After the war, I was able to read up and find out what it was all about. But I was sent to NYU in engineering. And apparently this was a thing that General Leslie Groves, in developing the atomic bomb, the Manhattan Project, he thought that they should be training some of these college students while in the service to help out on anything they needed. So we were there for a year, and just before we left, we were interviewed for something called the Manhattan Project. Several of the guys were taken for that. Out of that, mostly the ones that had machine shop experience or something like that that was very practical. It's interesting, after the war, I met one of my fraternity brothers, and he actually was sent to Los Alamos and then on to Wetak, and he actually crawled into the plane after that bomb was loaded and attached something to it. So he had a very personal experience with this. But this whole program was geared towards the science of things. But again, they didn't, the Army thought that this was a waste of manpower, that they were needed to fight instead of sitting around in college. So most of these programs were called up after only a semester. It was unusual, so we spent a whole year at NYU. After that, I assigned to the Corps of Engineers, and they didn't know what to do with us. Just the Battle of the Bulge occurred, and the day before, I was assigned to the engineer school for some reason, and the rest of this group the next day were sent over to fill in on the Battle of the Bulge. And so I spent the winter studying aircraft landing field layouts and how to go out and draw a contour map for the troops out in enemy territory so that they could follow through and so forth. And then after that, they didn't seem to know what to do, and I did something you usually don't do in the Army. I volunteered for something. They said there was a very hot outfit, and it was a floating power plant, and consisted of 40 of us, and we were to apparently we were being prepared to take it in on the invasion of Japan. The Army and its great intelligence decided that we needed some extra training, so they sent 3 of us up to Philadelphia, and we were put on board a hopper dredges about the size of a merchant ship that was built in 1908 that had old reciprocating engines. And they said, all right, you guys run the engines on this thing for 3 weeks. This will train you. It was rather interesting, too, because the engineer, who was then a civilian, had been in combat. And anyone had to be very careful. You didn't drop a wrench on this metal floor. Anything with a sudden noise, and this man would just turn to jelly and start crawling on the floor. But then they interviewed the 4 of us and took 20 and put on board the ship with which was a big barge, not seaworthy, had windows instead of portholes, so on. They had a seagoing tug and towed it to the Philippines with 40 of the 20 of the 40, and I was one of the 20 that was selected to go to Florida and train on a similar one in Jacksonville. After the war, I looked up the reasoning on this, and it was because they said that if the thing hit a wave or a strong storm, the turbines and generators would punch a hole in it, sink like a rock. Why lose 40 men when you only need to lose 20?
Perfect sense.
So everything that was involved in the service seemed to be hit or miss. You never knew what was going to happen next. And that carried through, too, because we were sent to the port of embarkation and then held back on that. And on Thanksgiving Day in probably 45, this was after VJ Day, they called us all out just before they served a big Thanksgiving dinner in the mess hall. Said, all right, all the troops are coming back from the Pacific, and you non-coms are now acting mess sergeants. The rest of you are cooks. We don't have time to train you. Here is the Army cookbook, which had recipes. I still have it. It has recipes based on 100 people for each recipe. Oh, incidentally, you also be the medic on the train. We don't have to train you, but that'll be all right. Just go ahead. And you're leaving tomorrow. So I spent the rest of my time in the service traveling back and forth on troop trains, bringing all the guys from Pacific back for discharge.
So you built a heck of a resume in that short period of time, from mechanical engineer to mess sergeant to med tech. So you were well designed. I just want to stop for a second. You mentioned the name George Rayner.
Yes.
You actually gave a presentation on him as one of the great Chautauquans. Can you give us kind of a Reader's Digest on George Rayner?
Well, again, Chautauqua School was a very small school, and he had been principal. This is the other thing that's very interesting, because the school carried through generations. My parents went to it, and my children actually went there as well. Some of these teachers carried over from generation to generation, you might say. And George Rayner was a very upright man. I think it's interesting, I did a little research on him, and he actually was the principal in the school that Robert Jackson went to. And he had remarked that he was a very bright student. Not an exceptional person, but a very bright student. But, and George went away for a year, apparently, during World War I, the YMCA. And basketball was just starting. And he brought that back here. And the gymnasium, which is now the opera practice part of the school here, was built in 1928, and it was the biggest basketball court in the area, and all these other schools took up basketball at that point. It became one of the smallest ones eventually, but this was a major sport that George brought. But the school was different in as much as, I think in terms of the study hall, every morning started with a reading from the Bible, a songbook, and we all had to sing. He also would have a few words about if some of us had a party and he heard about it, why he would sort of chide us for our behavior. So it was a very personalized school.
So let me get this straight. George Rayner is a connect between Robert Jackson and you.
Yeah.
Okay, can I get your autograph later on? Guy couldn't help himself. He just had to bring up Jackson. The guy's amazing.
Yeah.
So that's why you selected him principally to honor George Rayner, was that?
Yes, he actually was a trustee during a period when Chautauqua was coming very close to closing. So he was a trustee during that period when Chautauqua didn't know whether to continue on or not. So I thought he was very important to Chautauqua as well. And at that time, many of the teachers and their families were in Chautauqua. There was quite a large number of students that walked to school from the grounds. And he was a vital part of the Chautauqua community.
Bill, I don't think I asked the question yet, but what was your introduction to Chautauqua institution? I mean, you're so affiliated with it now, but there had to be an aha moment or some exposure.
Well, it started, and they did not have kindergarten, so it started in first grade. My parents moved up to a house that still stands on the corner of Hearst, and, well, it's diagonally across from the Lene Center. Moved up there for the winter. There's a place that he had remodeled for someone. And so I walked to school from there, and I can recall walking along. They were building Norton Hall, and they had all these tarps and canvases up curing the concrete on the walls of that building. The other thing, I can recall going to Sunday school. This is before Hurlbut was built, and they heated the Methodist house, and so they had services there during the winter. So that was my initial contact. And then, of course, hearing about Edison being here, John Philip Sousa, and so forth. The other thing that I do recall, and this would be much later, the year that Roosevelt spoke for a hate war speech, that was not as well attended as Elf Landon coming that year. And my parents thought that Roosevelt was devil incarnate. He was messing up business and everything else, you know. And so we went up and saw Elf Landon, not Roosevelt. But
What kind of crowd did Landon get? Was it a packed house?
yes.
Yeah.
And I can vaguely remember we walked along a brick walk, and after the talk, why, they had escorted Landon over to see the Hall of Philosophy, so I got to see him close up.
Yeah. What other early recollections do you have of Chautauqua? It sounds like your initial introduction was really through your dad being a contractor, had a house here that was, did you live in it while he finished it? Is that how it worked out?
No, it was completely
Finished,
finished,
yeah.
you know. It was just a matter of, it was not a new house at that point, it was remodeled.
Got it.
And then various jobs, I would quite often after school go down and go home with him and so forth. He had one of the things that he did in, I think, 37, he built a home for Henrietta Campbell and tore down the Indiana Inn for that house, tore down 3 rooming houses across the street for her gardens, which are now have been donated to the institution. And the number of other houses that were being built at that time. There were one of the houses that he built next to the Hall of Philosophy during the Depression. There were 0 building permits in Jamestown, and yet Chautauqua still was building houses.
As you close your eyes and you think of Chautauqua during those 30s, what I've read about it is times were tough here on the Chautauqua, near bankruptcy, and what was your sense of it at the time? Was it a...
Well, as a child, you really don't realize these things. We were always, actually people who had a rural background were much better off. Had gardens. My dad would go hunting for pheasants and rabbits and so forth, so that added meat to the table. We had no sense of real deprivation, although we didn't expect anything lavish, as we were taught to get by with what we had, but we did not suffer like many of the people in the cities did.
What was your family's reaction when you went off to war? When you finally got involved? Did you get a sense, was there a encouragement, patriotism, or was it a remorse?
I'll go back to what I started out. Our parents let us grow up. We were not micromanaged. We were not even given clues to what was expected of us. So I don't recall any reaction, do you?
No, patriotism. Everyone was patriotic at that time.
Yeah.
They expected the boys to be in service.
So after the service, you come back to the States. Talk to me about your next steps.
Well, my father was absolutely swamped with work, so I spent the summer helping manage his construction crews and so forth. We just finished up the sample boathouse, and there were about 4 other jobs going during that summer. in order to build a new house at that time, there was practically nothing being produced. I was scouring hardware stores trying to find hardware for the doors. There'd have to be different doorknobs on each door practically in order to finish a house. And then that fall, I went back to school. I presented all the credentials I had from NYU and asked them how long it would take to get an architectural degree, and they said 2 years, but I could get a mechanical engineering degree in 1 year. And with all the guys coming through on GI Bill and so forth, I felt the sooner I got out, the better. And I was married at that time anyway and wanted to move on with life. So I spent the year 46, 47 finishing school and got my degree in the spring of 47. The commencement speaker at that time was the president of GE, and he looked at this group and he said, "What's the matter with you guys? It took you 7 years to get through this school." Because practically everyone had been out for about 3 years in the service.
Then you come back here and you do start working with your dad, and Carolyn tells a story that in the 1949 time period, Walter Shaw, later vice president of G.C. Murphy Stores and a member of Chautauqua Board of Trustees, decided he wanted a home in the grounds on the lake. Since there was no more lots available, they considered the north end. Now things change here at Chautauqua. What was your role in all of that?
Well, it was primarily, we had quite a large construction crew. We had other jobs as well going. I had to survey at that point, everything from Prospect, from the park and the bathing beach to Packard Manor was grown up with sumac and brush and so forth. So I had to have guys hack some sight lines so I could do a topo survey for the architect. The architect said he had a plan for a foundation in, and so we started October 1st and finished the project at the beginning of the season in June, and the architect finished the drawings the same time we finished the house. But actually, this is what instigated. Chautauqua does not change easily, and usually someone has to initiate change. And in this case, they said, "We can't," told Walter Shaw, "you can't possibly have a house there. There's no sewer, no water. We have no facilities." The architect says, "I'll lay out the place for you." And Chautauqua's engineer, I believe Cliff Cheney, designed the sewers and so forth. And this was put on the market, and the lots were picked up very quickly. A regular lot was $1,500. Corner lot was $1,750, and I think a lakefront lot was $2,700 or something like that. Some people bought lots and just held on to them and resold them later. But this was a post-war housing boom, and it was reflected in Chautauqua because this gave Chautauqua a chance to expand, and this happened very rapidly. At a 10-year period, and this was all filled in pretty much. Of course, Chautauquans said, well, they can't possibly be Chautauquans. They're not in the center of things. It's like a suburb, you know. They called it the Gold Coast.
Mm-hmm. Where were you living at the time? Did you live on the grounds?
No. I had bought a cottage across for my parents, just up from Cheney's Point a ways, and winterized it. So, yeah, I was commuting back and forth, and much too busy to really enjoy Chautauqua. I didn't get a chance to do that much until I retired.
You were on the board, right, weren't you? Board of Trustees?
No.
No? No. You were involved, you got involved significantly in the arts. You were one of the 9 founding members of the Friends of the Theater, and involved with the Bratton Theater remodeling. What's your sense of the art? How did you get involved with that part of Chautauqua?
Well, this is what I enjoyed in retirement, was the ability to get involved with different groups of people that had entirely different backgrounds than anything I'd ever had. So I got involved in the Art Association, in the theater, so on, because this was a good way to broaden out my experience, my acquaintances, and so on.
You folks, you housed for some time, folks in the Cleveland Playhouse, and
Oh, yes.
what was that? I mean, you get involved with a whole different genre of personalities.
Oh, yes, that was fun. I had a lakefront cottage just down from my regular home, and I think the second summer that I was renting it, why Evie McElroy and some of the others stopped in and said, "Would you consider renting this to us for the summer? You know, we're in the theater, as if maybe I'd be horrified to think I had theater people there." And it was a great experience, and got invited to their parties where they would critique the audience and so forth. So that's what led me to get involved with the Friends of the Theater afterwards.
AFS. How did you start your 35-year connection with the American Field Service?
Well, that is an interesting story. Tom Hune and his wife took a trip to Europe, and on the plane they met somebody from the State Department. And Tom said, "Well, how could an ordinary person living way out in the countryside get involved in things going on in the world?" The State Department man said, "Well, there's a little organization in New York that is doing great things. They are bringing high school-aged children over and putting them in families." So Tom came back, and he and Florence and Paul Norton got involved, and they formed a group, a chapter here, and had a girl from the Philippines come here. And this girl, Perla, was very dynamic. She spoke to all the other schools in the area. The next year, I think there were 10 schools in the county signed up to do the same thing. And I was fascinated because my experience in college was with foreign students. Some of my best friends were foreign students. We sat alphabetically in classrooms, and there was Fischer from Guatemala, and a guy from Cuba, another guy from China, all sitting around me all the time. Made good friends with a guy from Greece, another guy from Switzerland. So I thought this would be a great way to get involved, and I couldn't possibly travel at that point, but it'd be a great way to get involved with things going on in the world. So shortly after that, we hosted a boy from Japan. He was 6 months old when the bomb went off. He was from Hiroshima, but he was over a hillside from the city and wasn't affected. After his year here, he went to college and then went into the Japanese Foreign Service. They sent him back here, and the Japanese do a really good job of training their Foreign Service people. They sent him to Princeton Graduate School of Economics to be a Japanese diplomat. He went back. He and his wife are here and visited quite frequently. Then he became part of the UN delegation from Japan. After that, he was in Washington as the handling the defense treaty between the U.S. and Japan, and then the economic and trade relations between the two countries. Then ambassador to South Africa. Then he was up 4 diplomats just under the prime minister. He had risen that high. Got in some political argument, so as a punishment they made him ambassador to Korea. And he finished his career there. Actually, someone threw a chunk of concrete at him there because there was some dispute over some islands between Korea and Japan. But he's now retired. But I also, the children were off to college. I thought it was a great thing to have continued relationship with young people. And so I pretty much had Chautauqua County as, well, Florence Norton was the representative of Chautauqua County, and then she left for California for a while after her husband's death, and I took her place. And then when she came back, she was in charge of all of West New York, and I worked under her for this area. And it involved placing students, interviewing families, and so maintaining chapters in each community, doing the counseling, and so forth.
So you enjoy dealing with younger folks, keeping that juices flowing, and that's the message I'm getting from you, Bill. And I'm looking around this room here, how disappointed you must be in tonight's audience.
Oh, most of them are younger than I am right now.
Good segue. On August 2nd, 2012, you gave a talk at the, I guess the Bird Tree and Club, and you started off by saying that there is something about the Chautauqua experience that makes most of us eager missionaries to inform the ignorant about the glories of this institution. Describing this place is a real challenge because it has so many offerings for different personal interests. And then you go on to have this talk about Chautauqua. Tell us what you normally, I mean, here you are, you're one of the missionaries here on the grounds. You're the go-to guy in many instances. You've made John Schmitz what he is today. I mean, it had been nothing but for you.
Oh, no. I would say the reverse is true.
No, I know it differently. So, when they ask you about Chautauqua, what are some of the highlights you talk about? So, educate me.
Well,
I'm a guy who lives in Lakewood.
yeah. Well, I don't know of a place where anyone can meet such a variety of people from such a variety of backgrounds. Now, that's not true in respect to, I mean, they all are pretty much in a certain class, but still their experiences are very interesting. And I think particularly our winter community is extremely interesting, that we have managed to think up things to do to keep us busy almost all the time. It's someone years ago got tired of hearing a question, what do you do here in the winter? And they took a picture of Florence Norton sitting on a snow-covered bench reading the New York Times. It is hard to describe, but it's a well, it's an intellectual amusement park with all these choices. And you can go anywhere you want with it. There are so many possibilities that you can follow a variety of interests and find plenty to do here.
Now, one of your specialties is giving tours of the cemetery. Was giving tours of the cemetery, and what drew you to that?
Blame John Schmitz.
Many people do. So go ahead, talk about it.
No, he proposed this, and of course, I do have an interest in local history, and particularly the factors that created this settlement here. And that cemetery is adjacent to Chautauqua, so people could come there, and it's filled with some of the first settlers that came in here, the Prendergasts and the Hunts. And there's very interesting stories to tell about all of them. Could take each one of these graves and describe a segment of the history of this county just from what they did.
And you give the tour now?
Pardon?
You still give that tour?
Oh no, 2 years in a row is enough, I think. So
you're at an age now where you get a free gate pass.
Yes.
What's that like?
Marvelous. I'm rushing down there each year in case they change their mind.
In fact, Carolyn, who wrote this here, said, at nearly 92, watching my best friend zip around the grounds on his shiny red bike with his free gate pass blowing in the wind, attending most of the activities, is pure joy.
It's pure joy to do it.
You obviously had exposure to Chautauqua just about as long as anybody here in the room. Is there a reflection on the good and the bad, or where you'd like to see this go? I mean, is there a pause as you look at Chautauqua over this last 70 years?
Well, Chautauqua's changed. I mean, Chautauqua's not supposed to change, but it does. We don't realize it. It was much more conservative in the 50s particularly. We built some houses on speculation on the north end. And in order to sell those houses, you had to check with the institution. And they'd say, well, who are you selling it to? Are they Chautauquans, or do they know Chautauquans? It was a subtle way of keeping out Jews. And they keep talking about how liberal Chautauqua was, but at least in that period it was not, and probably for a number of years previous to that. And there was a prejudice against Catholics. So, strong white Protestant.
Mm-hmm.
And that has changed considerably,
Mm-hmm.
much for the better. And I also, one of the condos I built, I was accosted by one of the little old ladies that said, well, I hope you're selling to old Chautauquans. Again, a code word.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to still be alert that because we hear some of this now, if they build a Muslim center or a black center or something, why is an undercurrent, well, we don't know about this, we better take it back to its origins and so forth.
Do you sense, though, there is a much more of an openness at this, for the board of trustees and everything? Just willing to have dialogue about issues, no matter what it might be?
Well, it's grown to a huge thing. Back in the 50s, if, for instance, if the engineer in charge said he didn't want me to build a house because he didn't like the design, I would go up to President Hazlett and say, here's a book, this is an accepted design, and I don't think it's fair that you don't let this be built. He'd say, okay, go ahead and build your old chicken house then, I don't care. But there were just a few people involved in the administration. And as Chautauqua has grown and offered more and more, obviously the staff has grown considerably. And I'm not privy to all the politics that go on in there, but I do believe that the Board of Trustees have considerably more responsibility than they had before. I had some former trustees mention that they felt they were just figureheads, that the staff went ahead and did what they pleased anyway. And I think this has changed to some extent. There is more active management by the trustees.
You know, you've touched a lot of lives here, not only on the grounds as a historian, as a supporter, also as a developer. I mean, you've had quite a few developments on here. Is there a Bill Flanders legacy in all of this?
No, I doubt it. No. The only thing that I reflect on my own life at this point, and I think I have followed a thing where I could do things I was interested in, feel I could do it if I wanted to, and things that I enjoyed. I was not interested in high achievement. I was just interested in having a good variety in life and learning all the time. And that's what I like about Chautauqua. It's a learning experience, no matter what age.
Well, we've learned an awful lot from you tonight, Bill, and we thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, Bill Flanders.
And putting a tattered old hat on top of it. My own feeling is that I would like to see the money spent on a up-to-date facility either in the south parking lot or across the highway, and let the amphitheater remain as a place for church services, organ concerts, and things like that. We have problem with venues for all the things that want to go on here, and seems to me that the thing could be worked out as a win-win if we left the amphitheater and had a better facility expanding Chautauqua. Of course, again, that has to be worked out financially and so on, and it's easy enough for all of us to have these ideas, but until you really vetted all the expenses and the possibilities, why, you can't be sure of anything.
Thank you.
You lived in Cheney's Point, but you went to school here. I know how Schofields got here in the winter. How'd you get here?
Well, this is very interesting. In 1925, the trolley line that went up our main gate here was originally built as the trolley station. And my parents came to school on the trolley. The school paid the trolley company to run the thing one additional year just to take the kids to school while they had encouraged a local man to help them finance to buy buses. And they started buses shortly thereafter. So, rode the bus to school. Actually, at that time, the school also ran buses to Asheville and Blockville and picked up people there, so they served a larger area.
That's nice.
You never walked across the lake in the winter?
Pardon?
You never walked across the lake in the winter?
Oh, yes. Actually, there were several kids in my parents' day from Bemis Point that wanted to play basketball, and they would walk across the lake to Stowe and catch the trolley to come up so that they could play basketball at Chautauqua. Oh, yes. I can recall before I was old enough to drive, I would ride my bicycle to Midway Park, and I had to make sure that I got back to that ferry before midnight, or I'd have a long bicycle ride home.
No matter how good you are, you couldn't walk across the water.
No, not across the water.
Let me just, we'll conclude with this, but you sent me a piece on your grandfather on baseball, a vignette, and I, for one, was incredibly interested as to his abilities dealing with a very famous Chautauquan.
Yes. Yeah. My grandfather, Emmett Flanders, was played on local teams. I think it was a Panama team. And they played Jamestown. And there was considerable betting on it. It was played at Marvin Park the first year that Marvin Park was established. And the Jamestown team had brought in a ringer from Buffalo. And so the Panama team found a guy that they thought was good. And my grandfather caught in this game with 2 broken fingers. In those days, they didn't have gloves. The catcher had a almost like a dress glove with a little pad in the middle of it. But then, about 5 years later, a batch of Yale students came to Chautauqua, and one of them was Amos Alonzo Stagg, and he was a star athlete at Yale, and he formed a baseball team, and he threw his pitches so hard that they couldn't find a catcher that could hold him. And they'd heard of my grandfather, so he came down and found him in a hayfield and convinced him to come up and try out, and he was able to do it. So he played on the Chautauqua team for that summer. And so it's interesting, William Rainey Harper, who was brought from a Baptist campgrounds across the lake by the institution to head up their university here, was a good friend of Stagg's and managed to get Stagg here. Well, Harper left Chautauqua to the University of Chicago and took Stagg with him, and Stagg formed their football team and formulated many of the rules that are in force today. Harper brought the CLSC idea of books to Chicago and started the Great Books course, which is still famous today.
It all works together. Again, thanks so much, Bill. Appreciate it. Let me give you this. This is sort of a thank you. You're welcome. You tied in nicely, Raider. You and Jack.